A family story told by Eleanor Brooks. The woman who called Margaret Hale's dead husband a thief had no idea that the real thief was standing only 10 feet away from her. And Margaret had been protecting his secret for 32 years. By the end of that night, one family would lose its fortune, another would get its name back, and a man who had been buried as a criminal would finally be buried as an innocent husband and father. Margaret Hale was 68 years old and owned a small bookstore on the coast of Maine. For most of her life, she had carried two things, a wedding ring and a shame that never belonged to her. 32 years ago, her husband Jonathan Hale was accused of stealing $300,000 from the largest company in town. 4 days later, he died. The newspapers called him a thief, the town called him a disgrace, but Margaret called him her husband and she never believed he stole a penny. Unfortunately, widows don't get to decide what history remembers. That evening, Margaret was standing inside the Harbor Crest Country Club for her son Ethan's engagement party to Olivia Ashford, a sweet young woman with kind eyes and a nervous smile. Margaret loved her, which made the situation almost unbearable because Olivia's father was Richard Ashford, the very man who had accused her husband all those years ago. Life has a strange sense of humor. Sometimes it makes your children fall in love with the children of the people who destroyed you. Margaret had almost convinced herself the past no longer mattered, then she heard a voice behind her say, "I suppose every town needs a little bookstore, even one built on stolen money." The room went silent as Margaret turned slowly to find Victoria Ashford standing beside the champagne fountain, smiling as if she had merely commented on the weather. Her husband looked uncomfortable, Margaret's son looked horrified, and Olivia's face turned white. As for Margaret, she felt something far worse than anger. She felt tired, because there comes a point when an old wound hurts less than the memory of carrying it. She smiled politely and said good evening to Victoria, who lifted her glass and said some things should never be forgotten. Margaret looked into her eyes, thinking that if only she knew, if only any of them knew, because hidden in the top drawer of her bedroom, wrapped in an old handkerchief, was the last thing her husband ever gave her. She had never understood why he left it behind, not until that night. Margaret excused herself and stepped outside where the sea air was cold. She sat alone on a bench overlooking the harbor and tried to steady her breathing, then she noticed an envelope that hadn't been there before. There was no stamp, no name, no address, and inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words, "He didn't steal the money." A brass key slipped from the envelope and landed in her lap. The moment she saw it, her blood turned cold because she had held that key before, 32 years earlier, on the last night she ever saw her husband alive. Suddenly she understood something that changed everything. Someone had been waiting 32 years to tell her the truth, and if that truth was finally coming out, then someone else had spent 32 years praying it never would. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in her little house above the bookstore and stared at the brass key resting on her kitchen table while the grandfather clock ticked loudly in the silence. For 32 years, the key had lived in the back of her dresser drawer, wrapped in her husband's blue handkerchief, and she had never thrown it away or understood it. The last time she saw Jonathan alive, he had pressed the key into her hand and said something she never forgot, "If anything happens to me, keep this safe." Margaret was angry with herself for not asking more questions, for not trying to use it, but grief does strange things to people. Sometimes it makes you search for answers, and sometimes it makes you hide from them. At 6 in the morning, Margaret opened the old drawer and found the handkerchief exactly where she had left it. The sight of it made her chest tighten as she could still remember the scent of his aftershave. She sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the fabric, and the key fit perfectly inside, the one from the envelope, the one she had carried for 32 years. There could no longer be any doubt, someone knew, someone had always known. She turned the key over and noticed something she had never seen before, a tiny number engraved on the side, 317. Then she remembered, bank deposit boxes. By 8 o'clock, Margaret was standing outside Harbor National Bank, the same bank Jonathan had used all those years ago. She almost turned around twice because part of her was terrified. What if she found proof that he really had stolen the money? What if the entire town had been right all along? But another voice inside her whispered something else. What if your husband died innocent? The young man at the counter smiled politely when she showed him the key and asked if it was safe deposit box 317. She could barely speak as she said yes, and he typed something into his computer. Then his expression changed as he looked at her and said, "Mrs. Hale, this box has been inactive for 32 years." Margaret felt her knees weaken as 32 years was the exact same amount of time her husband had been gone. The young man disappeared into the back room and returned carrying a small metal box, placing it in front of her and asking if she would like a private room. Inside the little room, Margaret sat down and lifted the lid. At first she didn't understand what she was looking at: a leather journal, several old bank statements, a sealed envelope, and a cassette tape. She stared at the tape, wondering who even keeps cassette tapes anymore. Then she noticed something written on the label in her husband's handwriting: "If you're listening to this, I couldn't protect you anymore." She stopped breathing. With shaking hands, she reached for the cassette tape, and inside the sealed envelope she saw a name that made her blood run cold: Richard Ashford. "I've noticed that some truths arrive like whispers, while others arrive like thunder." For Margaret Hale, the truth had been waiting 32 years, and when it finally came, it didn't ask for permission. It simply arrived. And it changed everything. Margaret sat alone in that little room at Harbor National Bank for nearly 5 minutes, staring at the envelope with Richard Ashford's name written across it. The room suddenly felt too small and too quiet. She had spent 32 years trying not to hate that man, telling herself grief made people say and do terrible things, telling herself perhaps he truly believed her husband had stolen the money. But now her dead husband's handwriting and Richard Ashford's name were sitting in the same metal box. She slowly opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a letter, it was a bank transfer, $300,000, the exact amount her husband had supposedly stolen. She looked at the account number, then at the signature, and her heart began pounding because the signature wasn't Jonathan's. It belonged to Richard Ashford. Margaret read the document again, then a third time, and realized her husband hadn't transferred the money, Richard had. A chill ran through her as she suddenly understood that for 32 years, everyone in this town had blamed the wrong man. She remembered the cassette tape, and with the help of an old player in the bank manager's office, she sat there with a pair of headphones over her ears. For a few seconds, all she heard was static, then a voice, Jonathan's voice. She nearly dropped the headphones because she had not heard her husband's voice in 32 years. "Margaret, if you're hearing this, something has gone terribly wrong." Tears filled her eyes as he sounded tired, exhausted, afraid. The tape continued, "I didn't take the money." Margaret closed her eyes. She knew it, she had always known it. Then there was silence, a door opened somewhere in the recording, and another voice entered, a man's voice, deep and sharp. She knew that voice too, even after 3 decades, Richard Ashford. "If he talks, we're finished." Another man answered, but the words were muffled, and Richard spoke again, "Let him take the blame. Nobody will question it." The room seemed to tilt as Margaret grabbed the edge of the desk because this wasn't suspicion anymore, this wasn't a widow's hope, this was proof that her husband had been sacrificed. The tape crackled, and her husband's voice returned, softer this time. "If anything happens to me, Margaret, don't let them bury the truth with me." The recording ended. Margaret couldn't move or breathe. She had spent 32 years mourning a husband the world called a thief, and now she knew something far worse. He had died trying to protect the truth. As she sat there crying quietly in that tiny office, her phone rang, and it was her son Ethan. She answered immediately, and he asked if she was all right and said Olivia told him she left the party upset. Then he said something that made her blood run cold. "Mom, why is Richard Ashford standing in your bookstore right now?" Margaret stopped breathing because she was at the bank, which meant only one thing. Someone else knew she had opened the box, and somehow Richard Ashford had gotten there before she could get home. Margaret left the bank so quickly that she nearly forgot the metal box on the table, and the bank manager had to call after her. She clutched the journal, the bank statements, and the cassette tape against her chest like they were made of glass because in a way they were. They contained the truth, and for the first time in 32 years, she was beginning to understand something terrifying. If someone had gone to the trouble of leaving her that key, someone else might go to great lengths to make sure she never used it. The drive back to her bookstore felt endless as she called Ethan twice with no answer, and on the third try he finally picked up. She asked if Richard was still there, and he said yes. She asked what he was doing, and he said he was just standing there. The word sent a chill through Margaret because Richard Ashford wasn't the kind of man who wandered into old bookstores. He owned half the businesses in town and had assistants, drivers, and secretaries. Men like him didn't browse used novels on rainy mornings, they came with a purpose. She told Ethan to stay there because she was 5 minutes away, then hung up and drove faster. When she turned onto Harbor Street, she saw Ethan's truck outside the bookstore and beside it a black Mercedes, Richard's. The bell above the bookstore door rang as she stepped inside, and the familiar scent of old paper and coffee should have comforted her. Instead she felt like she had walked into someone else's life. Richard stood near the history section, looking older than she remembered, thinner, his hair almost completely gray, but his eyes were exactly the same, sharp, careful, the eyes of a man who spent his life measuring risk. Ethan looked relieved to see her, but Margaret didn't take her eyes off Richard. He slowly turned, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he gave her a sad little smile and said he was hoping they could talk. Margaret almost laughed because 32 years had passed and now he wanted to talk. She asked, "About my husband," and the smile disappeared. Ethan looked between them and asked what was going on, but neither answered. Richard took one step closer and said, "Margaret, I know you went to the bank." Margaret felt every muscle in her body go still because he knew about the key, about the box, about everything. She whispered how, and he looked tired suddenly, very tired, and said, "I've been waiting for this day for a long time." That wasn't an answer, it was something worse, it was an admission. Margaret tightened her grip on the cassette tape in her purse and said, "You knew the box existed." A long silence, then he nodded. Ethan inhaled sharply and asked what box, but Margaret looked at her son, then back at Richard, and said quietly, "I listened to the tape." Richard's face lost all color as for the first time in her life, Margaret saw fear in his eyes, real fear. He sat down heavily in one of the reading chairs and stared at the floor for several seconds, then he said something she never expected, "I always wondered who would find it first." Margaret frowned and asked what he meant, and he slowly lifted his eyes to hers and said, "You weren't the only person your husband left something behind for." A cold shiver ran through her because suddenly she realized the cassette tape might not be the only secret Jonathan had hidden, and if that was true, then somewhere in this town there was someone else who had been carrying her husband's final message for 32 years. She stared at Richard Ashford as his words hung in the air, and Ethan looked completely lost, asking somebody to please tell him what was happening. Margaret took a slow breath, realizing that for 32 years she had protected her son from the ugliness of his father's death. But suddenly she realized the burden was no longer hers alone. She reached into her purse and pulled out the cassette tape and said, "I think your father was innocent." The color drained from Ethan's face as he asked what, and she handed him the bank statement. His eyes moved across the page, then he looked up and said, "This is Richard's signature." The bookstore became so quiet that Margaret could hear the old clock ticking above the register. Richard remained seated, looking like a man carrying something heavy. And finally he spoke, saying that her husband had left instructions. Margaret frowned and asked what instructions, and he swallowed and said, "If anything ever happened to him, I was supposed to give someone a letter." Her heart nearly stopped as she asked, "A letter?" He nodded slowly, and she asked why he never did, and for the first time he looked ashamed as he said, "Because I was afraid." The answer made Margaret angry as she said, "You let my husband die as a thief because you were afraid?" He shook his head, his voice cracking as he said, "No, I let him stay a thief because I thought the truth would destroy too many lives." Before Margaret could answer, the bell above the bookstore door rang and all three of them turned to see an elderly woman with silver hair walking with a cane step inside. Margaret had never seen her before, yet somehow she looked familiar. Her eyes went directly to Richard, then to Margaret, and she said softly, "I suppose I'm late." No one spoke as she took another step and said, "My name is Patricia Monroe." The name hit Richard like a physical blow as he whispered, "You." She nodded and said, "I heard Margaret opened the box." Margaret frowned and asked how she knew that, and she gave a sad smile and said, "Because I sent the key." The room went completely silent as Margaret's hands began to shake and she asked, "You left the envelope?" Patricia said yes. Margaret asked, "Why now?" and Patricia's eyes filled with tears as she said, "Because I'm 84 years old, and I don't want to die with this anymore. If you've stayed with me this far, please follow my story, because opening that box was only the beginning. Margaret thought she was about to learn why her husband died. She had no idea she was about to discover who destroyed him. Patricia slowly sat down in one of the reading chairs, then looked at Margaret and said the words she had waited 32 years to hear. Your husband never stole a penny. Margaret sat down because her knees suddenly felt weak, and Ethan looked as if the world had tilted beneath him. Patricia folded her hands and said, I was the company secretary. Richard closed his eyes as Patricia continued, I kept the records. And I lied in court. The words landed like thunder, and Margaret felt tears sting her eyes as she whispered, You what? Patricia looked at her and said, They told me to say I saw Jonathan move the money. Margaret asked, But you didn't, and a tear slid down Patricia's cheek as she said, No. The bookstore felt smaller by the second as Richard stared at the floor and Patricia's voice shook. She explained that she was a widow with 2 little boys, and they told her if she didn't cooperate, she would lose her job. Margaret swallowed and asked, Who told you? Patricia slowly lifted her eyes and looked directly at Richard Ashford, and for the first time since he walked into the bookstore, Margaret saw him begin to tremble. She suddenly realized something. Richard Ashford might know the truth, but he might not be the man who started the lie, and if that was true, then after 32 years, she still didn't know who had really destroyed her husband. No one spoke as the old clock above the register ticked once, then again. Ethan finally broke the silence and asked, Who made you lie? Patricia lowered her gaze and said, I've asked myself that question every day for 32 years. Ethan said that wasn't an answer, and she nodded and agreed. Margaret looked at Richard and asked if he told her to lie, and he looked up at her and said no, the answer coming so quickly that she believed him. But she asked, You knew she lied, and a long pause followed before he said yes. Margaret felt another piece of her anger shift into confusion because if Richard wasn't the man who forced Patricia to testify, then who was? Patricia reached into her handbag with trembling hands and removed an old photograph, sliding it across the table. Margaret picked it up and saw it was taken inside an office with 3 men standing together. She recognized one immediately, her husband, and she recognized the second, a much younger Richard Ashford. But the third man she had never seen before. Patricia pointed at him and said, That's the man who destroyed your husband. Margaret frowned and asked who he was, and Patricia swallowed and said, Charles Whitmore. The name meant nothing to Margaret, but Richard suddenly closed his eyes and whispered, Dear God. Margaret looked at him and asked if he knew him, and he said, He was our chief financial officer. Margaret stared at the photograph again, a stranger, a dead stranger perhaps, a man she had never heard of, and somehow he had ruined her entire life. Patricia's voice shook as she said, He moved the money. He created the false records. And he convinced everyone that Jonathan had done it. Margaret felt her heart pounding as she asked why, and Patricia looked toward the window and said, Because Jonathan discovered the truth. The room seemed to tilt as Margaret sat down, realizing her husband hadn't stolen the money, he hadn't even been suspected by accident, he had been targeted. She whispered, He was going to expose him, and Patricia nodded and said, The morning before the arrest. A chill ran through Margaret as she suddenly remembered something, the last breakfast Jonathan and she had shared, when he had looked distracted and worried. She had asked him what was wrong, and he had smiled and said, Tomorrow everything changes. She thought he was talking about a promotion. She was wrong. He had been preparing to tell the truth, and someone had gotten to him first. Ethan ran a hand through his hair and asked, So this Charles Whitmore, where is he now? The silence that followed lasted too long, and finally Richard answered, He's dead. Margaret felt something sink inside her as she realized the man who had destroyed her husband had died peacefully somewhere while Jonathan's name remained stained. Patricia nodded sadly and said, He passed away 15 years ago. Margaret closed her eyes, no trial, no justice, no confrontation, nothing. Then Patricia said something that made her eyes open again, But his son is alive. And he knows everything. The bookstore became completely still as Margaret asked what she meant, and Patricia reached into her bag again and removed a folded letter, saying she received this 6 months ago. She handed it to Margaret, who unfolded the paper and read one sentence, my father stole the money, and I have the proof. She stopped breathing. At the bottom of the page was a name she recognized instantly because she had seen it only yesterday on the guest list for her son's wedding. She looked up slowly, and for the first time that day she was afraid because the man who knew the truth wasn't a stranger, he was going to become part of her family. Margaret read the name 3 times, then a 4th, and her hands began to shake because the man who claimed to have proof that her husband was innocent was named Thomas Whitmore, Olivia's uncle. She slowly looked up, and Ethan frowned and asked what it was. She handed him the letter and watched the color leave his face as he whispered, "No." She nodded and said, "He's coming to your wedding." The bookstore fell silent as Patricia looked confused and asked if she knew him, and Margaret said, "Unfortunately, I do." She had met Thomas Whitmore twice, once at a Christmas party years ago and once again at the engagement dinner, a quiet man, polite, always standing at the edge of the room, and she remembered thinking how different he seemed from the rest of the Ashford family, never imagining he was carrying a secret like this. Ethan sat down heavily and said, "Mom, Olivia's uncle is the son of the man who destroyed Grandpa," and Margaret said it appeared so. He covered his face with his hands as for a long moment nobody spoke, then Richard did something unexpected and stood up, saying he was going to call him. Margaret asked if he still spoke to him, and he said not often but yes, and he reached for his phone, then stopped, his expression changing as he said, "That's strange." She asked what, and he said, "He isn't answering." She told him to call again, and he did, straight to voicemail. A cold feeling settled in her stomach as Patricia looked uneasy and said she hadn't heard from him in months. Margaret looked at her and asked, "You said he sent that letter 6 months ago," and Patricia nodded and said, "After his father died, he found boxes of old company papers in the attic. That's when he learned the truth." Margaret asked what kind of papers, and Patricia said she didn't know, he wouldn't say over the phone. Ethan leaned forward and asked, but he said he had proof, and Patricia said yes. Ethan asked, and then he disappeared, and she nodded again. The room suddenly felt too warm as Margaret looked at Richard and asked, "When was the last time you saw him?" He swallowed and said, "At Christmas." She asked if he mentioned the letter, and he said no. She asked if he mentioned her husband, and he said no. Margaret stared at the photograph in her hand, another dead end, another secret. Then her phone rang and all 4 of them jumped. The number was unfamiliar. She answered, and for a moment there was only breathing, then a man's voice, soft and nervous, said, "Mrs. Hale?" She said yes, and he said, "This is Thomas Whitmore." Margaret stood up so quickly her chair nearly fell over as he said, "I've been trying to reach you." She couldn't speak as the man continued, "I think it's time your husband came home. He died a thief. He shouldn't have." Tears filled her eyes as she pressed her hand against the counter and asked, "Mr. Whitmore, where are you?" Silence, then he said, "I don't think I have much time." A chill ran through her as she asked what he meant, and another long silence followed, then he said something that made her blood run cold, "They know I contacted you." She looked around the empty bookstore and asked, "Who knows?" The line went quiet, then came the answer, "My family." Margaret couldn't breathe because until that moment she had believed the secret belonged to one dead man, but suddenly she realized something much worse. There were still people alive, people close to them, who had spent 32 years protecting the lie. She whispered, "Mr. Whitmore, are you in danger?" and she heard a door slam somewhere on the other end, then hurried footsteps, and then his frightened voice, "Mrs. Hale, if anything happens to me, the proof is in the blue box." She asked, "What blue box?" but no answer came. She said, "Mr. Whitmore," and heard him take a sharp breath, then one final sentence, "Don't trust." The call ended. Margaret stared at the phone as the bookstore was completely silent, then Ethan spoke, saying, "Mom." She slowly lowered the phone. For the second time in 2 days, someone connected to this secret had disappeared in the middle of a sentence. And somewhere in this town, there was a blue box. And someone desperately did not want them to find it. For a long moment none of them moved as Margaret was still staring at her phone as though it might ring again. Ethan finally spoke, asking who he meant when he said, "Don't trust." She swallowed and said she didn't know, but that wasn't entirely true. A terrible thought had already entered her mind because the last thing Thomas had said before the line went dead was that they know he contacted her, his family, the Whitmores, the Ashfords, the people about to become her family through her son's marriage. Suddenly, the engagement party seemed very far away and very dangerous. Richard sat heavily in his chair and said, he sounded frightened. Margaret agreed. Richard rubbed his face and said he hadn't seen Thomas in months. Margaret looked at him and asked, but you know where he lives? He hesitated, then nodded and said, on Seaview Lane. She grabbed her purse, and Ethan immediately stood and asked where she was going. She said, to find him. Patricia looked alarmed and said, perhaps you should call the police, but Margaret asked, and tell them what? That a man called me and mentioned a blue box. No one answered because they all knew it wasn't enough. Yet. 20 minutes later, Ethan and Margaret were driving towards Seaview Lane as the sky had turned gray and rain threatened in the distance. Neither of them spoke until finally Ethan looked at her and asked, do you think Grandpa knew all of this? She kept her eyes on the road and said, I think your grandfather knew enough to be afraid. He asked, and you really believe he was innocent? She glanced at her son, having never heard him ask the question before, not once in 32 years, and she nodded and said, with my whole heart. He looked out the window and said, when I was little, kids used to call me the thief's son. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she said, I never told you that. He said, I didn't want to make it worse. She reached over and squeezed his hand, saying she was sorry, and he gave her a small smile and said, it wasn't your fault. But it had shaped his life just as it had shaped hers, and suddenly this wasn't only about Jonathan anymore, it was about her son, about the family they might have been. They pulled into Seaview Lane, and Thomas's house stood near the end of the street, a small white cottage with the front door slightly open. A chill went through Margaret as Ethan saw it too. They got out of the car, the wind picking up, and she knocked once with no answer, then again with still nothing. Ethan slowly pushed the door open and said hello, but silence answered. The house looked undisturbed with a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, still warm, and Margaret felt her stomach drop because someone had been there recently, very recently. Then she heard a faint beeping sound and followed it into the study where a computer screen glowed on the desk. Beside it sat a photograph of Thomas with an older man, his father Charles Whitmore, and next to the photograph was a blue wooden box. Margaret stopped breathing as Ethan whispered, the blue box. She stepped forward and found the lid wasn't locked. Inside were dozens of papers, old company ledgers, bank statements, letters, and on top of everything, a sealed envelope with 5 words written in neat handwriting, for Margaret Hale only. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, then she heard a noise behind them, a floorboard, and someone was in the house. Ethan turned around, and another sound came, a door closing, then footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming toward the study. Margaret looked at her son as he looked at her, neither of them breathing because suddenly they weren't alone. The footsteps stopped just outside the study, and Ethan moved instinctively in front of her. For one terrifying second, she thought someone had come to take the blue box, then a voice spoke, please don't call the police. Margaret knew that voice. She hurried into the hallway to find a man standing there, soaking wet from the rain, his face pale, his breathing uneven, and a fresh cut above his left eyebrow. She whispered, Thomas. He gave a weak smile and said, I was hoping I'd get here before anyone else. Margaret felt her knees nearly give way as she said, you're alive. He looked confused and said, of course I'm alive. She stared at him and said, you sounded terrified on the phone. He said, I was, and looked past her toward the study and asked, did you find the box? She nodded slowly, and he closed his eyes in relief and said, thank God. Ethan stepped forward and asked, who are you afraid of? Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, my own family. The room fell silent as rain began tapping against the windows. Thomas sat heavily in a kitchen chair, and for a few moments he said nothing, then he looked at Margaret and said, you deserve the truth, Mrs. Hale. She carried the blue box into the kitchen and placed it on the table as Thomas rested his hand on it and said, my father kept these papers hidden for decades. Margaret frowned and asked why, and he said, because he was a coward, with no anger in his voice, only sadness. He said his father found out what happened after the money disappeared. Margaret stared at him and asked, he knew Richard didn't steal it? Thomas looked surprised and said, Richard? A long pause, then he said, no. My father stole the money. Nobody moved as Margaret couldn't even breathe. Thomas continued, saying his father Charles Whitmore transferred the money and created the false records. Margaret said, but Patricia said. And Thomas said, I know what Patricia said. She believed Richard was involved because he signed papers he didn't understand. He looked at the old ledgers and explained that his father told Richard they were routine financial documents. Margaret looked at him and asked, then Richard didn't know? And Thomas shook his head and said, not at first. Margaret suddenly remembered the fear in Richard's eyes at the bookstore, not guilt but fear, the fear of a man who had lived with a terrible mistake. Thomas continued, saying when the truth came out, his father threatened Richard, telling him if he exposed the truth, the scandal would destroy both families and hundreds of employees would lose their jobs. Margaret closed her eyes as another terrible choice, another terrible silence. Thomas said, Richard chose to protect the company. Margaret whispered, and my husband paid the price. Thomas lowered his head and said, yes. The kitchen became completely still, then he looked at her and said, there is something else. Margaret wasn't sure she could survive another secret. He opened the sealed envelope addressed to her and handed her the letter inside. The handwriting was familiar, Jonathan's. Her hands began to shake as she unfolded the paper, and the first sentence stole the air from her lungs. Margaret, if you're reading this, I was never afraid of prison. I was afraid of who they would hurt after I was gone. A tear slid down her cheek as Thomas looked at her sadly and said, he wrote that letter the day before he died. She continued reading, then stopped and read the next sentence again, and then a third time because she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Ethan noticed her face and asked what it was. Margaret looked up at him, then at Thomas, the words barely leaving her mouth. Your father knew he was going to die. The room went silent because written in Jonathan's letter was the name of the man who had threatened him. And it wasn't Charles Whitmore. It was someone else entirely. Ethan stared at her and asked, Mom, who threatened Grandpa? Margaret looked back at the letter, almost unable to say the name because it belonged to someone she had known her entire life, someone who had attended her wedding, someone who had carried her husband's coffin. She looked up slowly and said, my brother. The room went completely silent as Thomas frowned and asked, what? Margaret swallowed and said, Benjamin Hale. Ethan actually stepped backward and said, Uncle Ben, and she nodded, feeling sick as 32 years of grief suddenly shifted beneath her. Jonathan's letter trembled in her hands with his familiar handwriting. Ben says they're frightened. He says powerful people can destroy our family if I keep fighting. He begged me to sign the confession and let it end. Margaret couldn't breathe. Her brother had known all these years, he had known. Ethan shook his head and said no, but Margaret wanted him to be right. She wanted to believe she had misunderstood, but the letter continued, I don't blame him. He's afraid. I think they're all afraid. But if anything happens to me, please forgive him. A tear rolled down her cheek as Jonathan had forgiven her brother before she even knew there was something to forgive. Thomas looked pale and said, I didn't know about this. Neither did she. Then her phone rang and she looked at the screen. The name made her heart stop, Benjamin. The room became very still as she answered. His voice sounded old and tired as he said, Margaret. She asked, where are you? And a long silence followed, then he said, I think we need to talk. She closed her eyes and asked, did you know? Another silence, then came the answer, yes. One word. 32 years of pain collapsed into that single word. She sat down as Ethan covered his mouth with his hand. She whispered, why? And her brother's voice broke as he said, because I was a coward. The rain continued outside as he said, I've been a coward for 32 years. She asked, what did you do, Ben? And a shaky breath came through the phone as he said, the night Jonathan was accused, Richard and Charles came to see me. Margaret frowned and asked, why you? And he said, they knew I was worried about money. They knew my little girl needed heart surgery. She closed her eyes as he continued, they offered to pay for everything. The room went silent again as she asked, in exchange for what? His answer came in a whisper, for my silence. She felt as though someone had punched her as he said, I never touched the money, Margaret. I swear to you. But I stayed quiet. She remembered her niece, the surgeries, the hospital bills, all those years she had wondered how Ben managed to pay for them, and now she knew. I thought I was saving my daughter, he said, then his voice cracked, but every year since then, I've felt like I killed your husband. Tears filled her eyes as Jonathan had been right, Ben had been afraid, not evil, afraid. She asked, where are you? And he said, at the cemetery. She frowned and said, the cemetery, and he said, I'm sitting beside Jonathan's grave. No one moved as he said, I can't carry this anymore, Margaret. The words frightened her as she said his name, and he said, I have something that belongs to you. The original confession. She stopped breathing and asked, what? And he said, the fake one they forced Jonathan to sign. Her hands began to shake as the confession still existed, proof, real proof, and her brother had kept it hidden for 32 years. She whispered, bring it to me, and silence followed, then he said something that made her blood run cold, I was going to. But someone got here first. She sat up and asked, what do you mean? And she heard footsteps and voices, then her brother whispered, they found me. The lines suddenly filled with static, and she said his name, but no answer came. She called him again, then she heard one final sentence, a sentence so soft she almost missed it, they don't want the wedding to happen. The call ended. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Margaret realized that whatever was buried 32 years ago was still dangerous today. She didn't sleep that night, none of them did. By sunrise, the original confession, the blue box, and her husband's letter were spread across her kitchen table like pieces of a life she had never truly known. They had tried calling her brother again with no answer. They called the cemetery with no answer. Finally, just after dawn, the police called. Benjamin was alive, but he had collapsed beside Jonathan's grave, a heart attack. He was in the hospital, and in his coat pocket, they had found an envelope addressed to her. Inside was the document, the confession, the paper her husband had been forced to sign. Margaret stared at it for a long time. Jonathan's signature was there, but so were other signatures, 2 witnesses. One belonged to Charles Whitmore. The other made her blood run cold. Richard Ashford. She looked up and said, Richard knew. Thomas nodded slowly and said, maybe not everything. But he knew enough. She felt exhausted. After 32 years, the truth had become something complicated. There were no monsters, only frightened people making terrible choices. Then her phone rang and it was Ethan, saying, Mom, Olivia's here. A few minutes later, Olivia walked into the kitchen wearing sweatpants and carrying her wedding dress in a garment bag, looking like she hadn't slept either. She said quietly, I know everything. No one spoke as she looked at the papers, then at Margaret, and said, my father told me. Margaret blinked and asked, he what? And Olivia said, he came to my apartment at 4 this morning. Her eyes filled with tears as she said, he told me Grandpa Jonathan was innocent. And he said the wedding shouldn't happen. Margaret frowned and asked why, and Olivia looked down and said, because he doesn't think our family deserves your forgiveness. Margaret suddenly felt very tired as poor Richard had spent 32 years carrying a secret and had finally discovered that guilt grows heavier with age. Olivia sat down and said, I'm still marrying Ethan. The answer came so quickly that everyone stared at her, and she smiled sadly and said, I'm not marrying my father's mistakes. Tears filled Margaret's eyes as for the first time in 2 days, she felt something warm, hope. Then the front bell of the bookstore rang and they all turned to see Richard Ashford standing in the doorway. He looked older than he had yesterday, smaller somehow. He walked inside carrying a thin folder, and no one said a word. He stopped in front of Margaret, then he did something she never expected. He knelt. A 73-year-old man, one of the wealthiest men in their town, knelt on the floor of her bookstore. He said, I'm sorry. She couldn't breathe. He lowered his head and said, I was a coward. The same words her brother had used. He said, I didn't steal the money. But I helped bury the truth. A tear rolled down his face as he said, I thought I was protecting my company, my employees, my family. He looked up at her and said, I never imagined 32 years would pass. Neither had she. He handed her the folder, and inside were old company records and a signed statement, a confession, his confession. I want the truth told today. She looked at him and said, today, and he nodded and said, at the wedding. The room went silent. I was supposed to give a speech, his voice broke, I'd like to give a different one. Olivia began crying as Ethan took her hand, and Richard looked at Margaret and said, if you'll allow it, I want everyone to know your husband died an innocent man. Margaret couldn't speak. For 32 years, she had dreamed of hearing those words. But now that they were here, they felt almost too heavy to carry. Then Richard said something that made the room fall silent. I also need to tell you something else. He looked at his daughter, then at Margaret, his eyes filling with tears as he said, the doctors say I only have a few months left. I have terminal cancer. A long silence followed, then he whispered, I wanted to die respected. But I don't think I deserve that anymore. Margaret stared at him. The man she had hated for half her life suddenly looked like something else entirely, not an enemy, just an old man who had run out of time. Then he lifted his eyes to hers and asked, may I tell the truth before I go? She looked at the wedding invitation lying on the table. In 3 hours, their families would gather, and for the first time they would hear a story that had been buried for 32 years, a story that would change every life in that room forever. The wedding began exactly on time. The flowers were white, the ocean behind the ceremony sparkled in the afternoon sun, and almost every important person in town was there. No one knew they had come to witness something far bigger than a marriage. They had come to witness the end of a lie. Margaret sat in the front row beside her son. In her purse were Jonathan's letter, the original confession, and the brass key that had changed everything. Across the aisle sat Richard Ashford, looking tired, very tired, but strangely peaceful, as if he had finally stopped running. The ceremony began as Olivia walked down the aisle, beautiful and trembling, and Ethan looked at her the way his father used to look at Margaret, like she was the only person in the world. For one terrible second, she wished Jonathan were beside her to see it. Then she remembered, in a way, he was. The vows were exchanged, the rings were given, and the guests applauded. Then the minister smiled and said, and now, the bride's father would like to say a few words. Richard slowly stood, his hands shaking, and he walked to the microphone and looked out at the crowd. For several moments he said nothing, then he took a long breath and said, I was supposed to welcome 2 families today. A soft laugh moved through the guests, but Richard didn't smile. Instead, he looked directly at Margaret and said, before I do that, I need to tell the truth. The room became quiet as he said, I have lived with a secret for 32 years. Olivia inhaled sharply as Richard's voice trembled. 32 years ago, a good man named Jonathan Hale was accused of stealing money from my company. Margaret felt Ethan take her hand as Richard swallowed and said, he didn't steal it. Silence. No one moved. No one breathed. It was a lie. A murmur spread through the guests as Richard opened the folder in his hands and said, my chief financial officer stole the money. I discovered the truth too late. He looked at Margaret and said, and instead of fixing it, I helped bury it. A woman in the back gasped as Richard's voice broke, I let an innocent man die carrying my shame. The room had become so quiet that Margaret could hear the waves. Then Richard pressed a button on the remote in his hand, and the large screen behind the stage lit up. A moment later, her husband's voice filled the room, if you're listening to this, I didn't steal the money. Several people covered their mouths as Margaret closed her eyes. Jonathan, after 32 years, everyone was finally hearing you. Then came the second voice, Richard's younger voice. If he talks, we're finished. Another voice answered, let him take the blame. The guests sat frozen as the truth had arrived, and it had brought witnesses. The recording ended. Nobody moved. Then Olivia slowly stood and looked at her father as though she were seeing a stranger. Tears filled her eyes as for the first time in her life she said, Sir, is it true? Not Dad, sir." The single word broke him. Richard began to cry and said, "Yes." Olivia closed her eyes as the entire room seemed to grieve with her, not only for the lie, but for the father she thought she knew. Richard looked at Margaret and said, "I have terminal cancer." A murmur swept through the guests as he said, "I only have a few months left. I wanted to die respected." He looked down at his hands and said, "But I don't deserve that." Then he turned toward Margaret and said, "Margaret, I can't give you back 32 years. No, he couldn't. I can't give your husband his life. No, he couldn't do that either. But I can finally give him his name." He stepped away from the microphone, and then in front of the entire town, he knelt and said, "I'm sorry." Margaret looked at the old man kneeling before her. For 32 years, she had imagined this moment. She thought it would make her feel victorious. Instead, she felt tired and sad because justice had come, but it had come so late. She stood and walked toward him as the room held its breath. She helped him to his feet, then she said the only thing that felt true, "You should have done this a long time ago." He nodded through his tears and said, "I know." The ceremony ended in silence, but the marriage did not. An hour later, Ethan and Olivia became husband and wife, not under the shadow of a lie, but in the light of the truth. 3 months later, Richard Ashford passed away. A week before he died, he came to Margaret's bookstore one last time. He brought a new sign, and together they hung it above the door, "Jonathan Hale Books." Then he handed her a letter with 6 words inside, "Thank you for letting truth win." Margaret never saw him again. The following spring, they reopened the bookstore, and the entire town came. Olivia and Ethan stood beside her, and her brother stood there too, tears in his eyes. When everyone had gone home, she unlocked the door and looked at the new sign. Then she took her husband's wedding ring from her pocket and placed it beneath his photograph. She smiled, a real smile, the first in many years, and whispered, "You can come home now, my love." The evening sun poured through the windows as the sea breeze moved gently through the open door, and for the first time in 32 years, their name belonged to them again. Above the register, she hung one final plaque, "The truth may arrive late, but it never forgets the address." I've noticed that the truth has a way of finding its way home, no matter how long it takes, no matter how many people try to bury it, it waits. And when the time is right, it arrives. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments, do you believe the truth always finds its way home, even after many years? And if you enjoy heartfelt family stories like this one, please subscribe and join our little family here. Until next time, take care of the people you love, and never stop fighting for the truth. This has been a family story with Eleanor Brooks. Until next time, take care of each other.